All right. Thank you all for being here. Let's get started. We have one other individual who should be joining us shortly, but we'll get started right now. All right. So, topic one. Brian Landry, the fiance of Gabby Petito, has garnered an online fan base. These individuals seem to overlap with the incel community. Many of them claim that it was Brian and not Gabby who was the real victim of domestic violence. That this entire incident is an example of how men and their suffering are dismissed by the wider society. They also feel that women's aggression towards men is completely ignored. Do you feel that there is anything to their claims? Are men and their needs not taken seriously by society? Or is this an example of an undeserved victimhood mentality used to undermine the plight of women? So yeah, this was an interesting story that I stumbled upon. There is like a whole Reddit dedicated to Brian Landry. It looks exactly like you might imagine. And they've been going on and on about this, and then bringing in other grievances toward dealing with men, and then feminism and all that. So I just want to see, is there anything at all to this? Does this is buried in all this? Are there kernels of truth, something that we could maybe learn? So we'll start with introductions, with opening statements, and keep them under 3 minutes, please. Smash.
Yeah, so I want to be careful with this topic. I'm really conflicted. I don't think there should be responsibility on women to cater to men's hurt feelings. However, I think we do need to understand why men feel the way they do in order to understand why they react and act the way that they do. I think that some men likely put in what they think is good faith effort and are disappointed in their results, and that has somewhat of a factor to do with turning people into incels. I think there's obviously a lot more reasons there, but I think these men sometimes will even equate things such as being ghosted as abuse. And I also don't want to diminish the fact that I believe obviously there are male victims of abuse. However, I do think that in this case, there are many individuals who are celebrating Brian. I believe that they are opportunist rather than empathetic individuals who can relate to uh, suffering.
Thank you. Next, Joe, TheSillySerious.
Okay. There's a lot happening in this topic. Firstly, I want to acknowledge that everything that happens on Reddit is fucking insane, okay? And online communities, especially political online communities, noting that we're in one, are stupid and ridiculous. Politics online and politics in real life are quite disparate in terms of the idealization of a murderer, a suspected alleged murderer, does not represent some of the really genuine concerns that people interested in male victims of domestic violence have to share on the ground. I think there is a real feminization of social resources when it comes to helping victims of domestic violence. I think domestic violence and intimate violence really does affect men, and there are significant barriers to them receiving help. I think intimate partner violence is different from every other kind of violence, and the separation is important because there are instances where violence can go both ways. You have to be careful in saying that you're not saying that anyone's provoking abuse, which is very much used as something which shuts down claims of abuse, saying, well, you asked for it, you were involved in it, you brought this on yourself. That is not the same as saying that relationships can often have different forms of abuse which escalate and bounce off one another. And I think that the way that this is sort of being presented as an either or, either Gabby was murdered or Brian was the real victim, is super toxic. Even if Gabby was abusing Brian, she is still dead. And nothing changes that fact. And if Brian was being abused and he did not feel that he could seek help and there was no way for him to leave that relationship. This is often the thing with intimate partner violence. If we look at barriers, health barriers, economic barriers, community barriers, it is extremely hard for anyone, male or female, or in any other gender identity, to leave domestic violence situations. So if he really was being abused, physically or otherwise, and he felt he couldn't leave, that is something legitimate, which requires community thought about how we stop this from happening again in the future.
Thank you. Anna.
So basically I would say that, yeah, there's still an issue of like, I mean, it's kind of like age-old sexism, of course, is like the issue of like men's abuse not always being taken as seriously. But then I would also say that there's also the issue of like there's still a lot of hostile and benevolent sexism towards women that also still makes it really difficult for their abuse to be taken seriously as well. And one of the things that I've noticed with some of the people that like are sort of complaining, like thinking that, you know, he was might have been like a victim as well, which seems rather unlikely. But you know, you can't rule it out, of course. But it seems like I also see an issue with people not, it's been specifically in the Gabby Petito case, people not taking psychological abuse as seriously as well, since the police cam footage showed a good deal of that from Brian, but it's not very well recognized in our society and gets overlooked a lot. Some of the big red flags that like just jumped out at me, you know, having been trained in domestic abuse was, I mean, it was really quite significant. And I know that other abuse experts have said the same thing and like have seen the same thing that I've seen. And so it's just something to keep in mind. And also, I don't really know if I'm not really sure like regular healthy, like psychologically healthy men become incels. I don't really buy that. I have like my own hypothesis on that, but um yeah, I also did want to mention, though, that ghosting absolutely can be abusive. Not in all contexts, but there are certain contexts where it absolutely is recognized as a form of emotional abuse.
Thank you. Sonia.
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement so far in terms of the nuance to this. Obviously, Gabby is dead. That's a fact, and it seems like a lot of this movement, I guess it is sort of dismissing this and wanting to absolve Brian and paint him as the victim. But at the same time, there is a valid problem with men who are abused having their claims of abuse being quickly dismissed, oftentimes feeling like they cannot actually open up about their abuse because they'll be uh, judged to be either weak or making it up, etc. And it's a problem that there's a bit of a societal structure around seeing men as being aggressive and violent and women being oftentimes the victims. And even though this tends to oftentimes play out in terms of domestic abuse in that way, there are times in which it is the opposite. And the cultural framework that we have around this makes it easy for us to dismiss a man's claims about being abused, particularly by a feminine partner. So I think there are valid concerns there. I think we see this also play out not just in abuse cases, but we also see similar kinds of things play out in terms of family courts and divorce, right? And so there is an element of men being quickly dismissed by our society and by our courts uh, when they are coming out to talk about themselves being victims of abuse. And so, again, don't want to dismiss the fact that Gabby was murdered. Um, I don't know a ton about this story because I didn't follow it closely, but at the same time, we also need to pay attention to, yes, some of these concerns are very valid. I'm sure as Joe mentioned, the online community is pretty toxic and probably not the best portion of the community to listen to with regard to this, but we should still keep an open mind about it.
Means online ever the better option. But thank you, Sonia. Missy.
Actually going to play the devil's advocate. So there's two things I want to break this into. First of all, this is what I like to call missing white women syndrome. I'm actually Native American. I am half white, but there are so many Indigenous women that go missing every single year, and they never get the media coverage that just one random like missing white woman, and she's an attractive one at that, would get. Which nothing against it. Like obviously, it's very sad. I mean, and the second part I want to play the devil's advocate is that it seems like the media is a misogynic machine that automatically gives women the benefit of a doubt. So even if it's true that we can automatically assume that women are the majority group, which they are, of intimate partner dispute and domestic abuse, it seems like the public just believes accusations at face value always. And I don't know if anybody actually watched the body cam footage, but it seems that you can actually see the police altercation. They even treat this as like the woman is to be believed. And in the body cam footage, he seems very calm and she seems very agitated, and she actually admits to slapping him. So why isn't that considered? Why don't we talk about that? You know? Okay.
Thank you. Next, Toasty.
Well, I think while there is some merit to the arguments of like MRA, I do think that men struggle with like various issues. You know, depression. There's a court case that states that if a woman, she was 17 at the time, and the boy was 13, statutory rapes a boy and then gets pregnant, she can force him to pay child support afterwards. Like things of that nature, I think they definitely should be addressed, and they should try to be fixed as best as they can. Mental health is important for all genders. Abuse is important to address for all genders, but they don't actually like care. Like I feel like with MRA, they have never done a single thing to actually benefit men. If you go to their forums or any of their spaces, it's all reactionary. It's just trying to undermine women. If they had any actual like basis to try and help, like here, let's start a petition or let's protest this. No, they just post online about how much they don't like women, and they're just using Gabby's death as another scapegoat. Because if they actually cared, then they'd do something more than just post memes about haha Gabby's dead. That they don't care. They care about trying to shit on women. That's about it. But yeah, I think they don't realize how much feminism actually helps men, or the ideals of feminism, because a lot of the pain women face under like patriarchal systems is sort of reciprocal for males, like how men aren't supposed to express emotion and stuff like that, or those it's sort of seen like like gay, or you could get bullied for it as a guy, like being sensitive or anything like that. And that the opposite of that is women are seen as the over emotional ones, when really we just kind of express regularly, and men are more repressed in it. Yeah, I just the issues could be focused on more with feminism. MRA doesn't care. Yeah, that's about it, really.
Okay. Advent Sugar.
Hey, how's it going, guys? Okay. Well, let's begin with the fact that most domestic abuse is never reported. Let's face it, ladies, we all know somebody that they've called the cops and nothing's happened. Am I right? Well, let's see here. Psychology Today says that most men don't report it because of the societal obstacles against men and lack of support. And what that means is basically every time that they report it, it actually gets worse. That's terrible. You know what happens when a woman is domestically abused? We can go to a shelter. We have a hotline we can call. That does not exist for men. And while domestic abuse toward men is not exactly as aggressive as it is toward women, let's face it, I mean, hell, we have a whole show based off it, right? Snapped. Men, when they snap, well, we get a little bit of a Gabby Petito thing. So, unfortunately, I did see the body cam footage, and he's covered in scratches. He's covered in bruises, and she's crying hysterically while he is calm. We have a lot to break down as a society where it's not just men versus women, domestic abuse is a completely separate object. It takes a very specific kind of person to lay their hands on someone. It's not an everyday thing. And that's where I'm coming from.
Okay. Don't worry, Anna. We'll get to you. We're just doing the opening. Last but not least,
right, sorry.
no worries, friend. Last but not least, we have Stardust here with us. Thank you, Stardust, for making it. Much appreciated. Happy to have you here as always. Stardust, you can introduce yourself and then your opening statement for the topic.
Hi, I'm Stardust, STRDST _ on Twitch. You can find me on Twitch and sometimes shit posting on Twitter. This topic is definitely a very interesting and very important one because, like others have said on this panel, men's domestic violence perpetrated against men is not taken as seriously. There aren't the same amount of resources that are available to men. Partly that might be because of traditionally women kind of being like the homemakers, right? But that is no longer the case. Um, uh, both genders we're seeing more and more in the workplace now. And I think that although the results of domestic violence, it may result in death more often for women, it doesn't take away from the fact that it is pervasive, both genders or both sexes, and it is pervasive in underserved communities, and it's something that we should be looking at holistically. And I really liked what Advent Sugar said about it's not men versus women, it's domestic violence is its own thing that we all need to tackle. So.
Okay, open to the panel. Anna, you had your hand up first, so.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say that I found it strange that it seemed like some of the panelists brought up that Gabby was crying hysterically and like Brian was calm, and like usually it's the abuser who's calm. That's what we look for in assessing these cases. Like the abusers are usually able to stay calm, and it's the victim who's usually crying and a lot. And like a huge red flag that I found was that and this has been noted across like research, psychology research, that one of those red flags for it's specifically narcissistic abuse. A red flag is that like when the victim is crying and stuff, and like the narcissistic abuser keeps on going at them, like it doesn't stop them how it would for like non-abusive people. Usually when someone starts crying, they stop, like they feel they have empathy. And there was none of that. There was like not much concern or empathy in Brian, and I found that to be a bit of a red flag. And I know there were other abuse experts that mentioned that as well. But yeah, that's something to consider.
Okay.
Can I just say something to that? Because I think there's something really important that we need to consider as we go through this. We are doing a little bit of armchair experting, looking at body cam footage, looking and assessing people's reactions. People are individuals, they react in very different ways. Yes, there is some evidence about like how you can judge a reaction in terms of like not discounting someone because they're hysterical or crying, for sure. But also in a situation where the police are pulling me over, I'm going to react very differently to in the moment in an abusive situation where there's no third party watching me. So I just think we need to be a little bit careful. This is a problem. When you talk about things generally, it's difficult, but also when you talk about a specific case like this, we don't have the information that we necessarily need to be making these sort of...
I'm just talking about the trends.
Joe,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
love
no, I
that
know.
you brought that up,
Yeah.
though. So Newsweek and CNN both reported that she had a history of hysterics from previous boyfriends, including her parents. So it becomes one of those things where, is she prone to chaotic meltdowns, or is this a one-time thing?
Can I just also add that no matter what, she obviously did not deserve to die. And
Yeah.
like I feel like we're minimizing the broader picture here and what actually for sure did occur, which is her death.
Stardust?
Yeah, I just wanted to also add that instead of maybe analyzing this specific case, because we don't know exactly what happened behind the scenes, right? If we're talking about like if we're talking about domestic violence, there are plenty of situations where both parties are perpetrators of DV, right? There are plenty of situations where the relationship itself is so toxic that both people are guilty of perpetrating DV against each other, right? So I think that to have a productive conversation about DV, that we may want to distance ourselves specifically from analyzing Gabby Petito's case.
Yeah, I agree.
Agreed.
But also, let's
Um,
remember that the police are not investigating him as a suspect. They are investigating him on bank fraud. He is not a suspect still. He is only being investigated for bank fraud.
Yeah, I mean, this is the difficult thing generally in terms of like I always get a big reaction on these panels when I advocate for the decriminalization of or the partial decriminalization of domestic violence, because ultimately a lot of what we see, exactly what Stardust just said, intimate partner violence specifically is somewhat complex to detangle in terms of who the guilty party is and who the innocent party is. And in terms of actually reporting, a lot of the time people won't report because they require on the income of their abuser to keep their family afloat. A lot of the time people won't report because there are extreme mental health issues. A lot of the time people don't report because they love the person who is hurting them. A lot of the time people don't report because they are somewhat involved in the abuse and they know that they're not perfectly innocent. So instead of making this guilt and a blame situation, we really need to be looking at how do we de-escalate situations of domestic violence and make sure they're happening less and less. And we do that through economic solutions, health solutions, and community solutions, not necessarily criminal solutions.
And education.
I agree with that because oh, sorry. I didn't realize somebody else was talking. I can't see the entire screen. I'm so sorry. If I interrupted anybody, just let me know. I was just going to add on to that. That oftentimes people don't report because they don't want to see their partner have their stability put on the line. They don't want to see their partner have criminal charges put against them, because in most cases with DV, the person being abused doesn't want that person to be punished. They just want the abuse to stop, right?
Mhm.
They still love that person. So
Yeah, I wanted to add on to that. And it also kind of extends on Advent's original point that, like when she said that when men report, things get worse, and I think that's both genders. It doesn't matter that our system is completely out of whack, and yeah, I think reporting is scary within itself. People don't take it seriously. I also think that it's extremely it's a huge issue because as for victims, the way that we handle how sorry the way that we handle the reporting and abuse victims, it and their healing, it seems that it's really affected by the sorry it seems that it's really affected by the way that it's handled after they report.
Well, to go back to what Joe said, I think that the whole idea of like adding an element of Sonia, I'll give it to you next. I'm so sorry. I just saw your hand up. Adding an element where it's like, hey, like maybe we can do a societal thing. That's beautiful, but most domestic abusers are not who they are at home, honey. They are your pastors, they are your community leaders, they are your managers, they are your CEOs. They are people that you look to for guidance. They are not traditionally some Tom, Dick, and Harry, the mechanic that like might change out your oil filter. A lot of times they're not people you suspect. So why would I consider, oh, the person that like helps me pick up my lawn every year or every month or like helps me decorate my house to be like some terrible human being when he's the nicest person I've ever met? It is a disorder. To put your hands on somebody, to physically have power over someone, it is not some menial thing that can just be fixed with like societal, oh, hey, this is bad, don't do this, rub their nose in it. It's something serious that people like to hide. It's like a fetish almost.
Yeah, but Advent, I would just caution against pathologizing it too much, right? I 100% agree. This idea of a campaign that's like, oh my God, don't hit women, don't hit men, that's bad, don't hit one another. I don't think it is going to work in terms of that, because we know very clearly why people do hit their spouses. It's normal, or their partners. It's normally to do with stresses in terms of economic stresses, not having a job, not having somewhere to live, feeling sort of hopeless in their ability to provide, feeling instability in the outside world, so bringing that into the home and trying to take control in the home. Mental health pressures in terms of not being able to cope with depression or anxiety or PTSD. For instance, a lot of domestic abuses come from the prison system, where they are abused themselves and then take that out on their family when they come back out. Or
Do you have
even
statistics for that? Because I did not find that.
I can find that for you. Just give me, I'll just finish this and then I'll find you whatever statistics you want. And then on top of that as well, the inability to deal with a partner's mental health issues. Often when we're trying to take care of someone, but they have significant mental health issues that we don't know how to control, sometimes that becomes violent inexplicitly, without actual malice or cause. And of course, we have community factors. People don't leave because it's like, how could you leave your wife? She needs you. You're supposed to provide. Or like, how can you leave him when he's suffering, when he doesn't have a job right now? How could you leave him? How could you pull your family apart like this? So fixing the economic, health, and community factors would go much further to bring down levels of domestic violence. I'll find you those statistics now.
So
about prison, is that the one you wanted? Sorry, just which?
Oh yes, I would love that. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, sure.
I did not see that statistic when I started doing research, so I'd love that.
So we'll go to Zonia, Stardust, and then Anna. And Zonia, do your statement. But if you have mic headphones, it may be helpful, because when your mic activates, I think we're getting like a double thing, right? Like, yeah. But say your statement first.
Yeah. So the one thing I really wanted to kind of reinforce is what Joe was talking about with community services, community support, and such. Because one of the biggest problems with domestic violence is a sense of feeling trapped, feeling unable to go to anyone, unable to have anyone to talk with, or mediate, or even have shelters to go to, etc. This is something where there needs to be a lot more of a sort of a support system around. And once the police are getting involved, oftentimes it's a little bit too late, because usually at that point there's been an ongoing series of domestic violence for a while. And because usually the first instances of domestic violence do not result in someone calling the cops. They tend to escalate over time and get worse and worse and worse. And at a certain point, someone calls the police. So at that point, it's too late. So probably one of the most important things that I think we should definitely focus on and talk about is having resources and domestic dispute mediators and community resources for people, the ability to when a marriage, when someone before they even get to the point of leaving a marriage, just leaving the home to get away from the other partner, there's a lot of insecurity around that, a lot of question about what is going to come of me, what's going to come of the relationship, what's going to come of my kids, the house, rent, etc., my job, you name it. All these things are significant uncertainties that box a person in and end up resulting in them enduring an escalating series of domestic violence and things getting very toxic in the relationship to a point of potentially being very dangerous.
Very
I'd like to
interesting.
say something about what was mentioned in Stardust intro. You guys are saying this is not like a women's men's women's and men's issue, but it really is, because that's what I was focusing on when I was doing this topic, and that's the actual topic that we're talking about is men's domestic abuse overlooked more than women? So it really is a gender-based issue, and I'd like to bring up a case of where I think it's actually kind of true. If you look at what happened with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, if you notice what happened when they thought that Johnny Depp was the abuser, he lost the Pirates of the Caribbean. He was basically canceled on Twitter. All of this stuff happening. He started getting death threats, hate mail. As soon as the narrative switched around and it turned out that Amber Heard was the abuser, it took months of people complaining, petitioning, and everything for Amber Heard to even lose the Aquaman 2 sequel. So why is that? Why was that treated differently? Why was it when it was the man was the abuser, it was automatically believed? Because Amber Heard did not even get through to the court case. Meanwhile, Johnny Depp actually proved this in the legal system. And it still didn't have as much backlash.
I think you'll find that everyone on this panel is saying that the liberal feminist approach to domestic violence is failing. That's why we're saying it's not a gendered issue, because what we're saying is that the liberal feminist approach of believe women are always correct is not doing anything to reduce domestic violence. In fact, a reliance on the criminal and carceral system has not shown in any way to alleviate levels of domestic violence. So I would say in pushing for it not to be a gendered issue, we're actually doing exactly what you're saying. We're saying don't treat this as a women's men's issue, because that leads to ideas like believe women, or men are evil abusers and ultimately they're all toxic and trash and will hurt you. And that's why we're saying domestic violence isn't a gendered issue, because it does affect everyone, and there is like significant ways that men and women in relationships can feed into abusive patterns and cycles.
Let's go to STRDST, AmandaSmash. Is there someone else who wants to talk? Okay.
Once you take out the gender of these situations, that's when we can really focus on the issue itself, right? When gender is not this thing that we're focusing on, then we're focusing on the actual issue. And like Joe has brought up, it's the actual issue is that DV can be caused by all sorts of different factors, whether that is PTSD, whether that is economic hardship, whether that's mental illness, or taking care of somebody with severe mental illness, and oftentimes the repercussions of reporting DV will get that person, because again, the abused never want to enact like revenge on their abuser, right? Majority of the time, they just want the abuse to stop. They love the heck out of that person, right? So a lot of the times they end up staying with the person, and reporting it, even in a situation where it's very dangerous, they could die if it escalates anymore. Will get them get them abused again, right? It'll get them, just for reporting it, gets them abused again. So it's a really I don't know what the I don't know how to feel about specifically like the decriminalization, the partial decriminalization that you're saying, Joe. I can see the reasoning behind it. I do heavily agree with the idea of bringing more support to people, providing more support, providing more resources to people, regardless of gender, when it comes to domestic violence. So, yeah.
Okay. Anna?
Well, what I was going to say is that, first of all, it's really important to keep in mind, and something I saw over my, God, like 4 to 5 years of doing like domestic violence counseling, it's really important to keep in mind that victims are rarely ever innocent. There's no such thing as an innocent victim. Okay, most victims usually do have done, like, they fought back or whatever. It's extremely complex. Abuse is extremely complex. A lot of people really just do not understand these dynamics of control and power and dominance that happen in an abusive relationship. And so I never counseled one victim who was completely innocent, but they were absolutely victims. And it's just something to keep in mind. Then the other thing I was going to say is that psychology research is leaning heavily towards that there actually is a specific, there is kind of a profile of an abuser, and that's specifically Professor Donald Dutton's research. He suggests that abusive people are usually people who have personality disorders. That's what the research is leaning towards. It's about the person's personality. Having antisocial tendencies and stuff. That's the type from our research that we see. So
yeah. I also wanted to just add that between 50 and 75% of domestic violence homicides happen at the point of separation for women, and I can't find statistics on that for men. And I think that's obviously extremely relevant because of the topic, but yeah.
Let's go to Missy, then Joe.
She made me forget what I was saying, so she can go first.
No, I was actually going to say that point is interesting in terms of what Missy was saying about where gender does matter in this conversation, right? Because there are points where even if we try to take gender out of the overall conversation, there are points where we are going to see differences, and they are social differences in terms of like there is a physical difference in terms of like a push or a slap from a man. Generally, in terms of the way that we are physically built, is going to have a more physical consequence on the women that are getting abused than the other way around. That doesn't change the wrongness of the act. It just means the severity is changed based on physical characteristics, right? We also know that the levels of homicide are very different between men and women in domestic violence situations. I'm not even counting, there is so much research on queer relationships and individuals who are non-binary or trans, which is in itself much more severe than what we're seeing here. But I'm just focusing on heterosexual relationships between cis partners at the moment, because that's where a wealth of the research is, and where unfortunately a large portion of the abuse that we see is occurring. But the other thing in terms of gendering is this idea of how we socially see relationships. So a lot of the time there is this idea of the old sort of echoes of extremely patriarchal relationships in terms of women being property, right? So this idea of like, if I can't have you, no one else will. In Australia, we have like quite endemic levels of domestic violence and domestic homicide, and the way that women tend to die, unfortunately, is quite catastrophic. A lot, for instance, I don't want to like traumatize anyone, but a lot of women are set on fire in Australia. A lot of women are burnt. And this happens a lot in terms of violence as well, like acid burning and burning. People love to think that this is an issue that happens only in the Middle East or Southeast Asia, but burning happens a lot in Western culture as well. And it has to do with ruining the product so that no one else has access to it, so that you have no value outside of this relationship. So I think there is an echo of some sort of patriarchal norm in terms of that does impact why that is such a difficult time for women in terms of violence, why when a woman chooses to leave, the violence escalates quite severely, because there is a humiliation, and there is also this idea of ownership and not wanting anyone else to have that sort of product. I'm not saying that's the whole explanation, but I definitely think that it plays a part.
To give you an idea of what Joe's talking about, 1 in 3 women, which is about 30% of Australia's population, experience physical violence by the age of, like, after the age of 15. It is an astounding number.
Yeah, we have one woman die a week here at the hands of an intimate partner.
Wow.
That's a horrifying statistic. Can you send me the link to that?
Yeah, sure. I'll put it out right now.
I believe it's pretty similar in the U.S. too, but I think it's more generalized. Like it was including like rape, stalking, and domestic violence, and with all of that together, like 1 in 3 women have experienced that.
I put it in voice chat links.
I think to actually view domestic violence situations equally by both genders, we kind of have to analyze this. Here, I see a lot of words throwing out like vulnerable, controlling, dominance, and let's be honest, what do we think about when we think about those words? When you think controlling, dominance, you think masculine. And whether you believe that this is just a societal construct or biology, whichever you actually think this comes from, we can all agree that it's there. It's a tendency in movies. It's how they do cinematography. Like when the man is being dominant, they use like different angles and things. It's just, you know, the nature of the way we think. So maybe the problem is that we have this bias and we need to actually notice it when we're doing it and notice it. Because I would also like to point out some things in the chat too. I noticed that people started already victim blaming Johnny Depp, like saying things like maybe he shouldn't have married somebody half their age, or he's a little sus too. And do people say this about women victims as often? No. Like imagine if you said Gabby Petito, like she was a little sus. Maybe she shouldn't have been with such a weird guy. Everybody would have been like, you know, why the hell did you say that? That's awful. So why
Yeah,
are we
but
so quick to say that about a guy?
That's
go
the
back to the
topic, though,
Gabby
is that there are
Petito.
people that are
Women a
doing that.
lot.
No, to go back to the
We
Gabby
victim blame
Petito
women a
thing,
ton.
her parents
Sorry?
have been very adamant. Gabby Petito's parents have been very adamant that they thought that this was a good man. They still believe he's a good man. They're trying to meet up with his parents. Like it's like a whole thing where like they are more baffled than anyone.
Good men abuse people. We shouldn't separate that, I don't think.
Yeah, again, it's kind of getting back to the case though, which is currently unfolding. So
Yeah, we don't know enough yet. But to be fair, was it 3 or 4 people have been found in very similar graves within less than a mile of where Gabby's body's found? Let's see here. I've got the statistics. 466 women reported missing in Wyoming. 710 people reported missing in Wyoming between the year of 2011 2020. But 466 just within the last 3 years. Just within the last 3 years, 466 people. That is an astounding number of people. But you know what? We haven't reported on serial killers since Zodiac because we don't want to give them the attention. Now, is that a safer way to go about things? Is it better to be ignorant or is it better to know what's going on? Give it the fanfare. Let people know what's going on. Because we saw what happened with Zodiac. We saw and we go back to like, oh, they get these groupie, this fan thing. We saw it with Manson. We saw it with Fish. We saw it with every single serial killer that's ever gone to trial or been taken down by the police in some bloody manner. They always have a fan group, right? So where do we go from this? Do we let people know or do we kind of hold it in? Because let me tell you right now, there's a lot more serial killers out there than people I think actually understand.
Do we really not report on that? I mean,
We
I haven't heard anything, but I didn't
It
realize
is
that was
state by state discretion to announce whether or not a state has a serial killer. And most states use discretion to say nothing.
I'd also like to clarify that part of the reasoning for that is to protect the actual serial killers. I mean, even though they are killers, it's not just them. For example, child killers are a very specific example of this. These type of cases tend to get a ton of publicity, and it will completely ruin their chances of ever getting like a chance to prove they're innocent and in the future. So they do get all of those protections. They get name changing, protection by the Secret Service, all of those things.
Oh yeah,
So
you'd be so surprised by how many serial killers get protected.
Joe?
I would actually, this is very new to me, this idea of
Oh yeah,
protection for
Carol,
serial
I'll
killers.
give it to you.
And no, I'm very fascinated by it. But the reason that I sometimes avoid the discussion of serial killers on this topic, as prevalent as it may be for the Gabby case, right? But generally this idea of the random stalker in the night who's coming to get you as a woman, the reason I avoid that is because so much of our policy is based around the idea that that's the violence that is going to kill women, when we know for a fact the most dangerous place for a woman to exist is in her own home. And she is most likely to be killed by someone who cares about her deeply, whether it be a father, a brother, or an intimate partner.
It is just a little bit spooky how many bodies were found just this summer in the
Oh, I'm all
very
for spooks.
specific way. I love it, dude. So when I was talking to Doobie earlier, he was like, "Hey, can you find out a little bit of a conspiracy theory about some of this stuff?" And I went to every conspiracy theory forum and Reddit and Discord, and so far they all think it's a tunnel system that's leading to these disappearances. I am not in that belief, but it is crazy that there was 4 bodies found just this summer in the same exact style Gabby Petito was found in. The exact same, within less than a mile radius of each other.
Well, I mean, I live in Australia. We have serial killers everywhere, so I'm not discounting it. We had someone who literally stalked a highway, picking up women and killing them. So I'm not against it, but I am just restating for the record that the most dangerous place for a woman is in her own home.
I'm not even joking. Like, it's so terrifying to find out when these things are happening near you. About 5 years ago, there was like an elderly couple that was actually in my neighborhood that I knew, and they started uncovering bodies on the property. So that was terrifying.
I think it makes sense that
Well, am I right? Oh, he's done.
Mm.
Sorry.
yeah, obviously we don't talk as much about serial killers these days. Like, when's the last time you actually heard people talking about a serial killer in the news here in the U.S.? It isn't very common, but I think, like what Joe was saying, it's really important to recognize that the most dangerous place for women in our society, at least, and just in many many societies, not just like Western, for instance, is in the home. And but again, we're kind of veering off of the topic, which is talking about like overall, are men who experience domestic violence, are they overlooked in this case? And we were kind of stepping away from the, speaking about gender on the issue, but at the same time we kind of need to focus on the components of domestic abuse that fit with both if we're going to address
Oh, I'm
the
sorry. I
other, right?
misunderstood. I thought we were moving on. That was my mistake.
Yeah. All right. Well, I might have missed it though.
It's my mistake, trust me. Lord knows I'm all over the place.
Same.
Well,
Oh, by the way, out of all the women, out of all the people that went missing in Wyoming, 57% of them were women, but 60% of them were Indigenous people. So
So back to
keep
what I
that in
mentioned
mind.
before.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, it's always going to be the case that when I hate sort of intersectional calculus, but these people
Yeah.
are more at risk because you have less attention, less resources put to solving crimes perpetrated against you and protecting you from those crimes.
But we also have to remember that
Also-
indigenous law is a very different thing. It's a very different thing here in the United States. Unfortunately, we see quite a bit police do not pay attention to indigenous land, and if there's not enough indigenous police like in their police department, outside forces do not come to the help of indigenous people. It is so
From
rare.
actually living on a reservation, I can confirm this, that the police officers that we had there were actually Indigenous people themselves. So if there weren't enough people that wanted to participate, we just simply had a lot of lacking in the police department. So that's actually a big problem there.
let's go to Anna.
Well, I wanted to go back to the like men being like victims that are often like overlooked. Well, I think part of that, interestingly enough, is due to the fact that society in general tends to overlook like when people talk about abuse, they tend to focus on like physical abuse, but like emotional and psychological abuse is often overlooked by society, and it's often like devalued as not as important or not as harmful. And actually, there's research that shows that emotional abuse can even be more traumatizing than physical abuse. Yeah, that exists. That's actually like something I've learned repeatedly in my psych classes. A lot of people don't believe me when I say that, but it's actually true. It causes long-term psychological damage to victims, to be on the receiving end of psychological abuse. And so a lot of times, like, you do see men's complaints of like especially psychological abuse like kind of dismissed, though the same is true for women, of course, too, but even more so I think for men as well. And another thing I was going to say is that we should also keep in mind that there are a significant amount of abuse cases that can be resolved through couples counseling. Again, this is something research has strongly suggested, like repeatedly. We used to think that it was like, oh, you tell the victim to leave. No, not anymore. Like that's like from the 70s. That's like the feminists from the 70s were saying that. Honestly, like the feminists got a lot of things wrong. You can absolutely. I mean, no, it's true.
No,
like
no.
they do.
No,
No,
keep
you
going.
can
Keep going. No, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay, I mean,
No, it's fine.
it's true.
I'm playing.
Anna, did
And
you
like,
say
No, keep going,
What?
Anna.
I was just gonna say that, like, and so yeah, we do know that couples counseling can absolutely help people that are stuck in like an abusive cycle get out of it. We have tons of research on this, and now that's what like you're trained in.
Okay, so we'll
Noted.
do Stardust, then Toasty. I'm not sure if you wanted to jump in. Okay, Toasty, Smash, and then Advent. All right.
So yeah, so I definitely I definitely see what you're saying with the psychological abuse. I would just say that there is no such thing as physical abuse without the presence of emotional and psychological abuse, right? There is no such thing as physical abuse without that. So psychological abuse may be very, very damaging towards somebody, but somebody who is getting physically abused is getting physically abused as well as psychologically abused. They experience a lot of the times, if it's happening to somebody as a child, they experience health issues later on in life as well as PTSD, and they experience even like um, uh, physical effects from that psychological abuse, right? So yes, psychological abuse, it's real. It is real, 100%. But there is no such thing as physical abuse without the presence of psychological, emotional abuse. So
Yeah, for sure, definitely.
And it's not a situation where the two are in competition. I mean, ultimately, I think a lot of resources go to physical abuse because there is a direct risk of someone
Injury
losing
and
their
death.
life.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's not that the two are, it's not that one needs to be worse than the other. They're both heinous things that occur, and Stardust is right. You're not going to see someone repeatedly being assaulted without also seeing that person being the victim of severe emotional abuse.
Toasty?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, on top of that, like, because there's also like there's emotional abuse, there's physical abuse, but there's also the like sexual violence as well. And for men, that's like obviously women experience it, at least like according to research so far. It's not as researched for men, but women experience it on a much higher scale. But like for men, it's like the FBI doesn't even define force to penetrate as rape. So there isn't like a legal equivalent for like rape for men unless they are penetrated.
There's reasons for that. There's reasons for that.
What is that reason?
If you read the research on this, the reason is because whenever men and women both experience more severe trauma as a result of penetration.
I don't know. I think rape is rape.
Trauma.
Sorry,
Penetration causes most trauma.
Zonia and Joe,
That's
I have your hand. I got your hands, but I'm a little confused, and just so you can explain to me. So, Toasty, were you saying that like the FBI doesn't categorize that at all, like anything? But
no, I believe that it still does like categorize it as some form of sexual abuse, but it doesn't categorize it as rape, even though it's the female on male equivalent of rape.
Because rape requires penetration.
Yeah, under a lot of law.
Under the scholarly definitions as well. Same with the CDC.
Yeah, I think California recently kind of did something where, like, if you are force penetrating a man, that's considered rape now. But that is a state by state basis. That is not every state.
Okay.
I mean, forcing anybody against their will to engage in sexual activity is like really heinous, in my opinion, right? Even if it's not like a man being penetrated, even if it's him just being forced to penetrate somebody else, that's still pretty heinous. I would still say that's rape.
Let's go to Amanda, Advent, and Sonia, Joe.
Yeah, Stardust made my point. So
Advent. Stardust
Okay.
with the not raising of the hands. All right, go ahead.
To cover how many people are going missing and dying and all these domestic abuse things, the FBI, most state and most city police departments are very far behind on a lot of cases. Collection of data, collection of blood samples, collection of semen samples. Anyone can go to their local coroner's office and volunteer their time, take a 2-week to 6-week training course, and start gathering samples. You want to see some of this shit stop? Honey, you can be proactive. Volunteer. LAPD has put out PBs on asking people to show up left and right because their rape backlog is insane for domestic abuse. So get out there, girls and men. I'm not saying just anybody. Like, go.
The rape backlog thing is a huge issue in like every state in the U.S.
Yeah, it is.
Can I ask you ask the panel a question, I guess? Anna, you said something about how counseling has been shown to help, like couples counseling for abuse, and in the research that I've done, it seems to be that in most cases it actually doesn't. And so I'm just wondering if anyone else has anything to say on that.
What was the research on? Was it on battering? Because
No,
if it's a
so
battering
there.
relationship,
Yeah, I guess I don't have any
it
specifics.
depends on how the abuse is, because we categorize abuse on like a spectrum from like mild to severe, and if it's severe, no, counseling won't help. But if it's on the mild end, even physical violence, because I mean I've learned this in my program as well. Like you would see a lot of cases of like both people like kind of being violent, like using mild physical violence against each other, and like counseling does work with those cases, including even like emotional abuse as well. So it does kind of depend on the research that you find. So yeah, and also it depends on if the personality traits of the the abusive person, because obviously, like, if someone if they have a personality pathology, counseling won't, no, that won't do anything, because you can't treat a personality pathology. It's their personality.
Let's go to Zonia and then Joe. But I'm actually interested in what Anna just said, talking about like disambiguating, quote unquote, mild domestic violence versus like severe domestic violence, and whether that is useful thing to do. I don't know, but yeah, I'm curious about that. Go ahead.
That's
Well,
what research does,
Yeah.
I guess. Like, they
Yeah.
categorize it that way. Look, I'm
Yeah.
not saying whether I'm against that or for it. I'm just saying what they do.
I'm not making a judgment call. I'm just curious about that too. But go ahead, Zonia and Joe.
So the thing that I wanted to say has basically been hashed out at this point, but I just thought of something to kind of add to this as well, based on the spectrum of severity of abuse. Like, I know from just a lot of what I have learned about emotional abuse in particular is that a lot of emotional abuse serves to often trap a partner through various types of manipulation, putting a lot of blame on them, guilt on them, saying things like, if you leave me, I'll kill myself, things like that, right? I'm kind of wondering how that kind of element of abuse factors into trapping people in situations that they can't get out of, and how, as we were talking about before, like providing systems and resources and awareness to allow people to break free from these things um, and support themselves, how something like that can be understood. Because I've talked to people before where I've tried to encourage them to save themselves and get away from a relationship, and they would say, no, if I do it, so and so is going to kill themselves or something like that.
Joe, Missy, Anna.
Yeah, okay. So a few things. One, on the rape and penetration point. I would totally buy that there's a lot in psychology research about the differing effect of penetration versus non-penetration. I would say that either way, it's still assault. It's still a sexual assault. And the classification of things under psychology and law are not social or moral truths necessarily, right? So your experience as someone who is forced into a situation that you don't have any control over, where someone isn't respecting who you are as a person, what you want, that is damaging. And it's not less damaging or less rape or less significant just because it's not penetration. These are often legal and psychological categorizations that are used for that technical reason within that technical space, and outside of that space we don't need to use this whole sort of distinction of this is lesser because it doesn't involve this quality, right? And also, we know from history that psychology and the law don't always get it right. I mean, Anna would know this. The DSM categorizes male sexual dysfunction as not coming. So like that completely shapes the way we view men's sexuality generally, which in a negative way, in my opinion. And we know from the law that for a very long time, men could beat their wives and that didn't count. Men could rape their wives and that didn't count. So we know that these technical areas don't always get everything 100% right. On the counseling thing, I definitely think, because as I say, I'm not for a total criminal response, right? I think counseling is really important, because if we look at health as one of the key points, not being able to manage each other's mental health, having mental health issues, these are huge things which counseling can help. Ultimately, the deciding factor, though, needs to be, do both people want to be there in that relationship? And if it is anything short of 100% yes, then counseling should enable people to leave. It shouldn't be purely focused on, in the same way you would go to couples counseling if you thought you were going to get a divorce, right? I think most counselors would acknowledge that sometimes and they find out within the first couple of sessions, sometimes couples are coming to counseling because they want to fix their relationship, and sometimes couples are coming to counseling because they don't know how to leave. And I think the same is true in domestic violence situation. And while we should encourage keeping families together, fixing problems that can be fixed, if someone is being abused and doesn't feel that they have an exit because of emotional reasons, because someone is threatening to kill themselves, because they don't have community support, a psychologist's role in that situation is to enable them to leave that relationship. It shouldn't always across the board be one thing is better than the other. And I don't think any psychologist would push that. It would be, it's the whole reason you have case by case. You don't have psychologists being like, this is the answer now. You have individual relationships with individual patients, and you have individual prognoses.
Missy, then Anna.
Joe is based, by the way. So in the chat, somebody actually said, Sturgam said, we can't rely on counseling statistics for male sexual assault/rape victims as well because of the ubiquity of male victims avoiding treatment, which is actually a fantastic point. So while Joe is willing to accept the premise of some sort of psychological research that suggests that penetration itself is more traumatic, I'm not. I'm pro men just as much as I am pro women, and I think that the current terminology we have to classify rape kind of, makes men's issues seem less significant in the fact that it's just sexual assault, it's not rape. But to me it is. It's the same thing. Like, when we start classifying one thing as worse than the other, I'm actually a rape victim myself, and I've even noticed that I've gotten so much more special treatment than just typical sexual assault victims. And I never thought that was right either.
Okay.
But this is why I said that. Sorry, I'm just jumping in because my name was said.
Yeah.
These are technical classifications, so they shouldn't apply socially, in my opinion. So there's no point in a conversation where someone says, "I was raped," and you go, "Oh, were you penetrated?" And they go, "No," and you go, "Actually, that's sexual assault. That's not as bad."
Have you ever filed a police report? Because that is exactly what happened.
Okay, 100%, yes,
I did.
because that's a technical area, right? So I'm saying,
You know what the cops told me? What do you want me to do? Arrest the internet?
Okay, but
Well, I think that's away
saying,
from the point that she's making.
yeah.
No, yeah, I
So
understand.
I'm saying,
I'm just saying,
yeah.
look, it's an inactive system. It's got a lot of flaws. It's got a lot of loopholes, and it all sucks.
Yeah, and I'm saying that the technical distinction only matters in technical areas. So a legal distinction only matters under the law, right? So if you're going to a police officer, you're getting you're filing charges. That's when that classification matters. We shouldn't be going around telling people that they were less raped because some quality was missing. And I think to assume that men can't be raped by penetration
Without
is
penetration.
wrong.
Yeah.
Men can be penetratively raped. So I'm not making that distinction saying that only women can be the victims of rape. I'm saying that I believe that there may be some basis for saying that penetration has a different psychological effect to non-penetration. But that's not to say that anything is worse or better or that any claims should be treated differently.
So let's go to Anna, Zonia, Stardust.
Yeah, there are very significant, important reasons why penetrative assault is considered different from non-penetrative assault. So I don't want to get into it because it's going to be it's too triggering to get into, but like the details of it. So yeah, I'd rather not, but there are important reasons and distinctions, and I think people should look them up.
I mean, we could trigger warning this.
Okay.
I think maybe if people are saying that they don't want to already, putting a trigger warning on it past the pale.
You can just look it up.
Okay.
Why psychologists are insist that it needs to be treated differently.
I don't think it needs to be different. I think that if a man has like a harder definition of what considers rape, then we should probably take their sexual abuse seriously. I think that a man that is sexually abused as a rape victim, I think that they have struggled just as much as I have, and I am there for them, and that's why I want to protect them. And I don't think that there should be any distinction between how penetration is more damaging. Where does that even come from? Like, where does that logic even come from?
That's
like,
the point. It's illegal.
Something has to go in something for it to make it dramatic? No, you feel powerless. It's a sexual situation. You feel powerless regardless of the details.
I looked into the California Penal Code, and it definitely seems like California is quite a bit more forward thinking on this particular thing, because I pasted it in a VC chat. It actually talks about how threatening a man with like threatening to kill him if he doesn't have sex with you is considered to be rape under the California Penal Code.
This is very new, by the way, Zonia. This is as of 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, so I was looking through that. It looks like this has actually been something that's been pushed repeatedly for quite a long time. I remember hearing about some of it a number of years ago, and it looks like it finally passed. So there is, at least now, there is a legal statute around this in California, and this is something that could probably be expanded upon in other states and other countries, etc. And I think there's good reason for it as well. I think a lot of people have been manipulated into situations that we should be considering rape, right? So, anyways, go ahead.
I would say personally, I think that forcing somebody to penetrate somebody else is still rape. I would consider that rape. I would consider that abuse, because that is it's forcing somebody into an act that they don't want to perform. Just like orally penetrating somebody I feel like that's rape. I feel like that's forcing somebody to be orally penetrated is rape. I think it's a power dynamic, right? At the end of the day, when you look at this, somebody is making you powerless. They're making you experience something you didn't want. And I would say that, especially for men, I don't know everything about like the nuances when it comes to men, but I would imagine that the psychological distress that you get from like climaxing after like during an assault is like incredibly like difficult, right? Yeah.
Yeah, just piggybacking off of that. Yeah, it's difficult for men in a lot of places because, like I said before, the legal definition for rape, it doesn't apply the same to them for what would be woman on male rape in most cases, and that kind of backs people's ideas that like female on male rape doesn't even exist. I've had to explain to like grown ass men that like you can get an erection, like you could be forced to have an erection. It's not just when you're turned on by something, and it's perpetuated by both men and women. And it's sad, really. Honestly, it makes things even harder for them because I feel like the vast majority of people, I think just about everyone, honestly, would agree. Male on female rape exists, like it absolutely exists. But when you bring up female on male rape, it's like a controversial whether or not it's even a thing.
I mean, there are women out there that definitely don't consider rape against the man even a thing. So
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
And
I'm
I
saying
think
it's
they're
both
insane.
genders.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that suggesting that there is some sort of difference between the acts in any way should be construed to say that I don't believe men could be raped. And I'm going to stick to my point and I'm not going to change my point. This is technical language that exists for a technical purpose in a technical field. So if there's a distinction there, it exists only in those spaces and shouldn't be brought into social interactions between people. I'm not saying that we should be saying to people, well, you actually weren't raped because you weren't penetrated. Obviously not. But in terms of treating people's psychological trauma, a distinction may matter because it may change the way that you treat someone. And in terms of legal definitions, I think it's different. I understand the idea of power differences, but this has always been my point, is that this idea, the introduction of the carceral system to this sort of situation was needed, but what it has resulted in is a situation where we have rape and amazing, perfect sex. Okay. And anything else doesn't exist. These are the two kinds of sex you can have. And adding more distinction and definition does not harm victims. It makes it better for them because it gives them the language they need to describe their experience. It gives us different ways to treating people who don't have the language. They go, I don't know. I guess he didn't rape me, but I definitely didn't feel in control and I definitely felt coerced. And I guess under the legal definition, that doesn't count, but it definitely wasn't okay with what happened. They're now in a situation where they either have to exaggerate their claim and traumatize themselves by being convinced, oh, I was fucking raped, or they have to be like, actually, it was fine and nothing bad happened. So increasing the language does not in any way harm victims or deny the occurrence that something morally reprehensible has occurred. And we need to also, I will say it again, men can be raped with penetration. So just because women are heterosexual sex is understood as penetrative doesn't mean that men aren't very frequently raped with penetration, including digital penetration by women. Just suggesting that if you were a psychologist or if you were a lawyer, you may look at these things differently. Everyday lay people should not be making these distinctions. However, increasing the language that we have when we talk about sex is extremely important and does not invalidate victims of rape or sexual assault.
Go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, like, I don't want my words to be construed as, like, I somehow think that, like, male rape victims don't experience as much trauma. No, they do. They do. I counseled male rape victims, and, yeah, no, they definitely experience as much trauma and suffering as female victims. Um, I just think that the distinction is important for trauma reasons. And I mean, I kind of disagree with Joe a little bit that I do think it's important that society keep that in mind, though, actually, because there are reasons for it being distinctive. So, yeah.
Okay. See.
If you're going to continue to double down on this point that you think it's important for distinctions, you got to explain why. What's the psychological evidence? What's the evidence? How do I know that people under the technical term of rape actually are experiencing a certain degree of trauma that deserves a distinction? I would like to see the evidence. I would like to see some sources, these studies you talk about. So
Yeah,
you can send that to me. If you don't have enough time right now, you can send it to me later and I'll drop it. So
Yeah, sure. I could definitely do that for you. Yeah.
Well, this is kind of why, sorry to cut in, but this is kind of why I wanted to bring up the psychological aspect, right? In particular, the threatening and putting guilt and blame on the other person, because that's oftentimes where these kinds of, for male partners, where they often end up in a situation that we might want to consider it rape or very much is rape. I do, this is anecdotal, but I know other people who have been in those situations who told me that they felt like they couldn't even get out of the relationship if they didn't actually engage in sexual intercourse with a partner who is extremely abusive to them. And I think that I know from personal experience talking to people who have been through this that they felt very uncomfortable even talking about the situation, and they certainly wouldn't talk about it with their guy friends. So they really didn't have much of anybody to talk about it with. And they felt like they would get either their guy friends would laugh it off and be like, "Hey, what are you complaining about? You got fucked," right? Or they would be treated like they were um, you know less than they are because they already feel very compromised, and so they're very selective in who they even talk about it and who they open up with about it. And they feel they don't have anybody to really go to. So that's why I kind of wanted to bring up that aspect, the emotional abuse that kind of ties someone to them, and using that emotional abuse to demand that they have sex. It does bring us into the territory of rape. And that was why I wanted to further expand on that.
Thank you. All right. So,
Also, anyone that's in Al Anon or anything like that, we call it puddle jumping when you jump from one domestic abusive relationship to another just purely through sweet words. It is a cycle. It is hard to break. I think there are people linking links in the chat channel. Follow them. There is groups out there that you can just slide into with an excuse that you're just hanging out with your girlfriend. There's help.
Thank you for that, actually.
yeah. Anna, did you want to say anything?
Mm,
Just want
I guess no, it's fine. It sounds like we're moving on from the topic. I was gonna go into more on emotional abuse, but it's fine. If we're moving
No,
on,
I
that's
mean,
fine.
we still have a bit of time, so if you want to say it,
I'd
go
like to
ahead.
hear that if you'd like to go on about it.
Yeah.
So
Sure. The way that emotional abuse is measured is there's a few like clinical tools that are used that have reliable internal validity, external validity are and like one of those is called the MMEA, and it there's also an emotional abuse questionnaire, the EAQ. But anyway, yeah, we have some really great, reliable tools to measure emotional abuse, just in case anyone was wondering, because I often see people who will be like, well, how do you know what's emotional abuse? Like, how would you know? And it's like, no, there are actually really good ways that are empirically valid. And so emotional abuse is actually categorized as 4 different factors. There's Factor 1 is hostile withdrawal. Factor 2 is domination, intimidation. Factor 3 is denigration. And Factor 4 is restrictive engulfment. That's the one where, like, the restrictive engulfment is the type where the abuser is, like, kind of really possessive and, like, sort of, like, will complain about the victim, like, spending too much time with friends and, like, kind of very possessive, controlling. Yeah. But, yeah, and so, I don't know. That's just... yeah, if anyone wanted to know about
If
that.
you're as old as I am, they used to call it, you knock them down twice, you build them up one. It used to be things men used to tell each other, being like, oh, you know how you keep your woman in line? You knock them down twice, but you build them up once. So they're constantly, you're down 2, and you're like, oh, everything's okay now. And then you're down 2 again, and oh, everything's fine. And then you're down again. And then suddenly you're here, and then it's 2, and then you're back to middle, and then it's 2 more, and then you're back to middle. It's not fun. Keep an eye out for it. Gaslighting's real.